Hello, everybody, and welcome to Life Course Persistent Offending. This is authored by Moffitt. She wrote this in 1993, and this is my all-time favorite theory. And the reason it is my all-time favorite theory is that because it is so very tangible, that there's a lot that you can really literally, or figuratively put your finger on, so to speak, to identify crime. Incidentally, Moffitt is the only female theorist of this level of fame and with this power of explanation beyond feminist criminology, which we already talked about. But she doesn't focus on feminist criminology. She focuses on biological impacts of offending. Moffitt believed that there, and still believes that she's still alive, believes that there's a small group of people who do the bulk of the offending. Right. She doesn't think her argument is not, she does not believe that lots of people are just offending all the time. But what she believes is that there is a great deal of offenses and that a small group of people who are repeat offenders are the ones who are culpable for the majority of the criminal acts. Her theory postulates that there are two kinds of offending behavior. There is adolescent limited and there is life course persistent offending. So let's define adolescent limited offending. Adolescent limited offending exhibits antisocial behavior only during adolescence. Delinquency may result, and she argues it's because adolescents want to be adults, and they're limited by what they can do because they're adolescents. That if they were adults and they had the freedoms of adults, you would see the delinquent behaviors go by the wayside. So she's talking about things like drinking, smoking cigarettes or vaping, stealing things because you don't have a job, you don't have money, but you want goods, right? And she says that this is the kind of offending that is limited to adolescence because eventually you will grow up, you will be old enough to smoke and vape, it won't be a crime, you will be old enough to drink whenever you want, you will be making a living somewhere along the way, which will give you an income and allow you to buy goods rather than steal them. So that's the first category of crime that she defines in existence. The second is life course persistent offenders. Life course persistent offenders, according to Moffitt, begin their antisocial behavior very early in childhood. In fact, as young as toddler ages, about 3 years old. And that antisocial behavior will persist all the way through adulthood, with offending consistently in adulthood. Moffitt argues that it is physical development in the womb. So when mom's pregnant and baby is growing and developing, she argues that there is some sort of obstruction that happens during development in utero. And it is this obstruction in the womb that leaves a psychological deficit in some capacity, or it leaves a deficit in psychological development. And it is because of that deficit that the life course persistent offending continues throughout the life course. The life course persistent offender learns pro-social behaviors from environmental feedback, right? So, but however, there's a caveat here. So if there is that interruption in utero, and you are born into a positive environment where you are taught right from wrong, you are given consequences for bad behavior when bad behavior occurs, you will learn and you will not continue on with your antisocial behavior. However, for individuals who had the disruption in the womb, have this psychological development interruption, who are born into households that are neglectful or violent or negative or pro-crime, antisocial in any capacity, then there's no corrective measure for the child. The child never learns from pro-social feedback about boundaries and structure and consequences and discipline. If no one is there to teach that for somebody who is predisposed to criminality through this interruption in uterine development, there is nothing to learn from the environment and you will persist in your offending. In fact, your offending, according to Moffitt, may in fact get worse with age if there is nothing to interrupt it. So that's the difference between adolescent limited behavior or limited crime and life course persistent offenders. The argument here that Moffitt is making is that there is a biological predisposition to crime, but it's not a life sentence, so to speak, right? That there are many people who are biologically predisposed, but so long as you're in a positive environment, you're not going to become a criminal, and it's not going to have an impact on your life because we have the ability to learn, right? And this is the nature versus nurture debate that, nature is predisposing you to crime, but it's not a life sentence. As long as you nurture the environment, teaches you right from wrong, boundaries, guidelines, discipline, etc. But that biological predisposition is there, and People with biologically oriented predispositions and poor environments will engage in life course persistent offending. So couple of things that result in this, right? I want to talk about MPAs. That is short for minor physical abnormality. And MPAs are things that can cause disruption in uterine development, which is why it's very, very important that when somebody is pregnant and they are carrying a child and growing a life, that you take really good care of yourself, because literally there are lifelong impacts about things that happen in the womb. And you want to avoid certain things that are threatening to a developing baby, that otherwise, to a grown adult would not be of a threat. So MPAs are what we call minor abnormalities. They have no function. They're really just identifiers. They're really just things that we can literally point to on a person's body and say, that's an MPA. Your MPA doesn't make you engage in crime, but it does identify you physically as somebody who had some sort of interruption in uterine development, and therefore you are predisposed. And Moffitt has strong empirical evidence to support these MPAs. Okay, so for example, some examples of MPAs, and some of you may have these, and don't freak out if you do, because it doesn't mean you are a born criminal or that you are, destined to be a criminal. Because remember, the environment has its impact as long as you are in a positive environment. But things like extra fingers, we call that polydactyly. People who are born with extra fingers, that's an MPA. That sixth finger isn't making you commit crime, but it is in fact an identifier that something went wrong in utero. You're not supposed to have six fingers or six toes, right? It doesn't drive the behavior, but it is a biological marker saying, well, there was interruption in development here, and we know when there's interruption in development, there is a predisposition towards antisocial behavior. So extra fingers, extra toes, low set ears, curved fifth finger. That's a big one, and that's a common one. My husband and my son both have curved fifth fingers, and neither one are criminals. So like I said, if you have one of these, don't freak out. Multiple hair whorls. You can Google image that. It's kind of crazy. I've never seen more than 3, but it's just odd. It has no function. It has no detriment, but it is an identifier that there was an introduction or an interruption in development. People with furrowed tongues, you can also Google image that. A furrowed tongue is atypical tongue presentation, like there's ridges, it's not just taste buds. But these are MPAs, these are identifiers. And MPAs, well, how do they happen, right? How does this interruption in utero happen? Well, it can be caused by what we call teratogens. And teratogens are something that you are exposed to during pregnancy that interrupts fetal development in some capacity. There's a lot of teratogens that we have identified. I am sure there are teratogens that we haven't yet identified, but that we currently expose ourselves to. But there's a lot that we know of, and certainly when you become pregnant and you go for your prenatal visits, they will say, okay, make sure you stay away from but. And some of those are obviously drugs and alcohol. I mean, that's a no-brainer at this point, although it hasn't always been. I mean, people in the 1950s were smoking and drinking during pregnancy, and doctors were fine with that. But cleaning chemicals can be teratogens. You've got a lot of strong chemical agents in there, and just smelling the fumes, it can get absorbed into your system, and it can impact fetal development. Nicotine is a big one. We talked about that. Prescription drugs. This is why a lot of women, when they get pregnant, might be on consistent prescription. They'll say you have to stop until the pregnancy is over, because it could interrupt fetal development. Some forms of bacteria. Doctors will tell you, don't eat unpasteurized cheeses. Don't eat roe on sushi, because they can carry bacteria. It doesn't mean they always do, but they can. And if you are exposed to that while pregnant, it can cause an interruption in fetal development, which can ultimately result in these MPAs, which means your child is more likely to be predisposed to criminality. This is why I like the theory so much, because there's literally a chain of evidence, so to speak, where you can put your finger on it and you can identify it and follow the behavior. And I just think it's really cool. But the other biologically oriented issues that have been affiliated with life course persistent offending result in brain injury. Brain injury is a big one, and it's a hot topic of study. Generally with crime, and also just with aggressive behaviors. So when we talk about a brain injury, typically when there is damage to the frontal lobes, which is going to be the piece of brain that is right behind your forehead, which is why we have our foreheads. It's a nice big plate of skull that is there to protect our frontal lobes. But when we see people with damage to frontal lobes, we see a massive increase in aggression. We see a decrease in impulse control. We see an inability to practice judgment, and to think before action, and to stop an action based on those thoughts. We've also seen dysfunction in the right hemisphere of the brain. Right hemisphere of the brain controls facial recognition, and things of that nature, so that often people who have that damage, they can't read your nonverbal feedback, which results in awkward social interaction or a misunderstanding of what you're communicating, which can frequently result in aggression or frustration, simply because I don't know what you're saying or doing, and I'm not understanding it, and it's frustrating me. Those people have a hard time developing social bonds and maintaining family, and this lack of support system and this lack of ability to socially navigate can result in life course persistent offending and antisocial behaviors. When there is brain injury, we often see limited verbal function. Again, this results in frustration, aggression, etc., because you can't express yourself. If you can't express yourself, you can't necessarily get your needs met, and you're not getting normal verbal feedback the way you would if you could express yourself. Interestingly enough, and this is why I do a segment, and I have some video guys for you to follow up on. This is beyond Moffitt's scope of theory, but there is a huge connection in biological research and literature, neuroliterature, on brain dysfunction, brain damage, etc., and psychopathy. Literally, people who take blows to the head, especially repeated blows to the head, we see engaging in psychopath-like behaviors, aggression, violence, a lack of conscience, a lack of empathy, a lack of compassion for other people. This has been a huge area of study in professional sports, in the NFL in particular, which, these guys move at an amazing speed. They collide at an amazing speed. And even though they're wearing helmets, the human brain is not meant to take repeated blows. Every time we hit our head, there's not a whole lot of room in the skull. There's a very small amount of fluid between your brain and your skull that is there for shock absorption, but we're not meant to have shock absorption. So when you do take a hit, or when repeated hits happen, there's a little bit of shock absorption from that fluid, but ultimately your brain keeps crashing into your skull. Your brain is soft tissue, and therefore, damage results. And when there's damage, we see behavioral changes, because this is the center of, obviously all of your bodily function, but also your emotional regulation, your decision making, your impulse control, your anxiety, your aggression, etc. And certainly with CTE, we've seen a large number of very, very aggressive NFLers, who have arguably, had CTE, who have engaged in crimes, or they have engaged in murders and subsequently killed themselves. In fact, many of these individuals are purposefully killing themselves by shooting themselves in the heart so that the brain is intact and can be studied, because they believe they have CTE. Currently, CTE can only be identified post-mortem. So, once upon a time, they were a well-regulated, emotionally kind person. They play in the NFL for a really extended period of time. They take tons and tons and tons and tons of blows to the head. And now they have a terrifying temper that happens out of nowhere. They're very aggressive. They get violent, and they don't know why, and they can't control it. Right. So this is why I incorporate, the brain injury and the brain malfunction and the psychopathy videos, in addition to Moffitt's theory, because there's a growing body of research in this area to indicate how powerfully any sort of damage to biology, whether it's brain to the brain because you're playing sports or whatever, or you're in a car accident, or if it's just, as early as uterine development, prenatal development, has lifetime impacts, right? Lifetime impacts. And that is sort of the meat of Moffitt's theory. So, you will, for this week, have to watch the documentaries on psychopathy and neurology and how they're related. And I want you to tie that back to Moffitt's original concepts and theories of how biology and dysfunction, interruption in natural processes can result in criminality. And what implications does that have for the way we handle our criminals?